In this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the core concepts that govern how we work with Spring Boot. There are some underlying principles within Spring Boot that you will recognize when working with the framework. The overall goal of Spring Boot is to reduce the work required for Spring developers to use the Spring platform. Much of the manual configuration that we have performed in the past in order to work with Spring is now unnecessary. We no longer have to provide boilerplate configuration for each of our applications every time we want to use Spring. It really returns the focus of Spring developers to application development. Much of the developer's work is reduced by the convention over configuration principle. Under convention over configuration, Spring Boot makes decisions on your behalf that it hopes will match the most common behaviors desired by Spring developers. Under this principle, manual configuration is the exception. We only customize the configuration when we want to have it behave differently than the conventions that are commonly applied. Spring Boot uses reasonable defaults for the configuration that it automatically provides, and then we are provided with a mechanism to easily customize that configuration when necessary to fit our specific purposes. Now, just a warning, this convention is also applied to third-party libraries such as Hibernate. So when we allow Spring Boot to configure our Spring Data JPA projects, it automatically chooses our ORM provider, which will be Hibernate. Another tenet of Spring Boot is that dependency management should be made much simpler for developers. If you have ever fiddled with the versions of the different artifacts within your application, you know the difficulties here. Usually you will have some method that's missing on a class and you go out to find jar and you find out it's not in the particular version that you're working with, so you go out and find the right version, and then maybe that conflicts with a version that's required by another dependency. It's a mess. So the great thing about Spring Boot is that much of this work to configure all of our dependencies and mainly their versions is handled for us. When talking about Spring Boot, another thing that is strongly emphasized is that there is no code generation or requirement for XML. Now, I'm sure everybody has their own opinion on code generation. Some folks have had good experiences, others have had poor experiences. In my experience, I have not been in favor of code generation. I really like having that control. So I'm glad to see this part of Spring Boot. Now that we know what Spring Boot is trying to achieve, let's talk a little bit about how these principles are achieved. We're going to discuss the technical approach of the framework. One of the ways that Spring Boot reduces the amount of configuration the developer must provide is by performing automatic configuration. Essentially, Spring Boot will interview your code base in order to determine the features that you need from the Spring platform. So, for example, if you have a REST controller, Spring Boot is going to assume that you are working with a web application, and then it's going to consult the conventions for configuring a web application, and it's going to build those into your project. Spring Boot achieves this by using conditional annotations, which were released in Spring 4.0 to conduct that interview with your code base. It's going to make decisions regarding things such as security, persistence, web development, and other aspects of application development, and this frees you from writing explicit configuration for those components. Spring Boot is able to simplify dependency management by providing starter POMs and dependencies. So when you are building your application, you can choose from pre-constructed POM files, and they're going to define all of the necessary dependencies and transitive dependencies to build your application using the appropriate pieces of the Spring framework. These convenient dependency descriptors have a naming convention of spring-boot-starter, and you'll see these for many important areas such as web or for security, and you can rely upon these to easily configure the dependencies within your application. A major aspect of the technical approach is favoring executable jars. So, the jar is the packaging of choice for Spring Boot, and this often requires a bring your own container approach when we're developing Java web applications. Instead of building out a war and deploying it to a standalone container, we're now using embedded containers. Your jar contains everything it needs to run, and it's packaged within your jar file. Finally, a good build tool goes a long way with Spring Boot. While you are not locked into choosing a build tool, it is highly recommended that you use either Maven or Gradle, because Spring Boot is going to rely upon their dependency management system in order to pull down the artifacts that you need for your project. When you work with Spring Boot, the folks at Spring have provided you with several options. First is the traditional Spring Tool Suite integration. So there is tooling built into Spring's Eclipse-based IDE that you can work with in order to build out your projects and perform their initial configuration using Spring Boot. There's also a command line interface that you can use to quickly set up a prototype project which you can further expand into a full-blown Spring application. Another mechanism that Spring provides is the Spring Initializer web page. So this is a web page that you can go to and you fill out a form, and it's going to provide you with a zip file, and within that zip file is going to be all of the configuration that you have requested for your application. So it will set up a Spring Boot project for you, and it will have the various components such as web, security, persistence, whatever you request via the form. So there are multiple avenues to working with Spring Boot, and all of these are going to make your life easier as a developer because you're going to spend less time focusing on configuration and more time focusing on developing your application.